In the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, where shattered factories claw at a sunless sky and the wind carries the smell of fire, rot, and hopelessness, nearly 300,000 Axis troops, Germans, Romanians, Italians, Croatians, and volunteers from across Europe, found themselves encircled in what many survivors would later describe as a living grave. It was a moment that changed the course of World War II, a catastrophe that Hitler refused to acknowledge until it was far too late, and one that Germany would never recover from. This is the story of how an army, once feared as unstoppable, was consumed by a city it had been ordered to conquer. A city whose name became synonymous with doom. Stalingrad. The road to disaster. The summer illusion. The summer of 1942 was blazing hot across the Eastern Front. Dust hung thick over the steppes, clinging to uniforms, rifles, and tank tracks as the Wehrmacht surged eastward. After the failure to take Moscow in the previous winter and staggering losses in 1941, Hitler demanded a new victory, one so colossal it would restore the aura of German invincibility. He believed he had found it in the South. The German High Command launched Operation Blue, a massive offensive aimed at seizing the oil-rich Caucasus and cutting off the Soviet Union from its most vital resources. Oil, Hitler repeated it constantly, was the lifeblood of modern war. Control it, and Germany would dictate the pace of the conflict. Lose it, and the Reich's enormous war machine would grind to a halt. Yet, as panzer columns thundered toward the Volga, Hitler made a decision that almost no military strategist could fully understand. He diverted forces toward a symbolic target. A name, a challenge. A city he believed would break Stalin if captured. Stalingrad. A name that could not be ignored. Many generals, Friedrich Paulus among them, did not initially grasp why Hitler suddenly demanded the city's capture. Stalingrad had industrial importance, yes, factories, rail links, access to the Volga, but its symbolic weight far outweighed its strategic value. Hitler's generals wanted to bypass the city. Hitler wanted to erase it. He famously declared, "The city that bears Stalin's name must fall." To him, it was a duel between dictators, an ego contest, a symbol he refused to leave standing. But this fixation would tear Army Group South apart. By splitting his forces between two objectives, the Caucasus and Stalingrad, Hitler stretched logistics to the breaking point. Supply lines became perilously thin. Armored divisions were forced to radiate outward instead of maintaining a concentrated push. The decision would prove catastrophic. But in the summer of 1942, with morale still high and the Red Army in retreat, very few, if any, foresaw the trap slowly closing around them. Stalingrad before the storm. A city, waiting for war. Before it became a battlefield of unimaginable suffering, Stalingrad was a thriving industrial metropolis of over 400,000 people. The Volga River sliced through the city like an artery, feeding shipyards, tractor factories, and steel mills that produced tanks for the Red Army. As the Germans approached, the civilian population faced a brutal choice: flee or help defend the city. Many could not escape. Hundreds of thousands stayed. Some by force, some by duty, some simply because there was nowhere else to go. Eyewitnesses recalled the oppressive heat, the metallic taste of smoke drifting in from distant bombardments, the distant rumble of an approaching war. When Stalin issued his infamous Order Number 227, not one step back, the meaning was clear. Stalingrad would not fall without unimaginable bloodshed, a city waiting for war. Before it became a battlefield of unimaginable suffering, Stalingrad was a thriving industrial metropolis of over 400,000 people. The Volga River sliced through the city like an artery, feeding shipyards, tractor factories, and steel mills that produced tanks for the Red Army. As the Germans approached, the civilian population faced a brutal choice: flee or help defend the city. Many could not escape. Hundreds of thousands stayed, some by force, some by duty, some simply because there was nowhere else to go. Eyewitnesses recalled the oppressive heat, the metallic taste of smoke drifting in from distant bombardments, the distant rumble of an approaching war. When Stalin issued his infamous Order Number 227, not one step back, the meaning was clear. Stalingrad would not fall without unimaginable bloodshed. The Red Army digs in. Soviet General Vasily Zhukov, commander of the 62nd Army, surveyed the coming battlefield with grim clarity. He understood the Germans fought best in open fields, using tanks, mobility, and combined arms tactics. Stalingrad, however, offered a different landscape entirely. Factories, collapsed buildings, endless rubble, an urban labyrinth where tanks struggled, where artillery fire ricocheted unpredictably, and where every building became a fortress. Zhukov told his officers, "We will hold the city or die in it." This was no mere slogan. The Red Army in Stalingrad truly understood the stakes. Lose the city, and the Volga would fall into German hands. Lose the Volga, and the Soviet Union would be split. So they prepared to fight not just block by block, but brick by brick. If needed, with knives, shovels, and fists. The Germans had no idea what awaited them. The German advance. 1. Underestimating the enemy. By August 1942, the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, advanced toward Stalingrad with confidence bordering on arrogance. The Soviet forces had been pushed back repeatedly. Supply lines, though stretched, still delivered enough fuel and ammunition to maintain the offensive. German high command believed the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. They believed the Red Army was exhausted. They believed they would repeat the quick, decisive victories they had achieved in 1941. But Stalingrad was different. The Soviets were defending their own soil, their own homes, their own families, a city bearing their leader's name, and Hitler, from his distant headquarters, continued to demand its destruction. The first bombardment. On August 23, 1942, the Sixth Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. That same day, the Luftwaffe unleashed one of the most devastating bombing runs of the entire war. Waves of German bombers rained fire and explosives for hours. Factories burned. Residential blocks collapsed. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed, many in their homes or in the streets as they fled. The Luftwaffe turned Stalingrad into a charred wasteland, what pilots later described as a sea of fire. Hitler was pleased. To him, this was evidence that the city would fall quickly. But in reality, the destruction favored the defenders. A ruined city offered endless cover, choke points, and ambush sites. It became the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, where soldiers fought in basements, sewers, and shattered hallways. The Germans had no training for this. The Soviets had no choice but to excel at it. The city of death. House-to-house carnage. The fight for Stalingrad rapidly devolved into one of the most brutal urban battles in world history. Snipers perched inside factory rafters. Machine gun teams concealed themselves behind mounds of bricks. Grenades were tossed down stairwells in constant exchanges. Even nights offered no respite, only the groans of the wounded and the echo of distant gunfire. The Germans advanced by meters. Not miles, meters. One officer wrote, "You take one floor of a building in the morning, lose it in the afternoon, take it again at night. This is Stalingrad." Despite the horrors, German morale remained relatively intact. Many still believed the city would fall before winter. They couldn't have been more wrong. Grain elevator, Mamayev Kurgan, Red October. Every corner of Stalingrad became a battlefield with its own legend. The grain elevator. A group of Soviet soldiers, cut off, low on ammunition, held the massive concrete structure against repeated German assaults. Even when flamethrowers and tanks were used against them, they refused to surrender. Mamayev Kurgan. The strategic hill that overlooked the city changed hands so many times that corpses, shattered equipment, and shell casings covered the ground in layers. Soldiers described the soil as black and greasy from blood. Red October Factory. The Germans expected to take the factory in hours. They fought for weeks. Workers who once built tanks now use those same machines to defend the factory floor. The Soviets fought with a resolve driven by desperation. The Germans fought with discipline, but they were becoming exhausted. Winter was approaching. Supplies were dwindling. And Hitler still believed victory was imminent. Cracks in the axis, the fragile flanks. As the Germans pushed deeper into the city, their lines stretched dangerously thin. Hitler had placed non-German Axis armies, Romanian, Italian, Hungarian divisions, on the flanks of the Sixth Army. These units were under-equipped, under-trained, and lacked effective anti-tank weapons. German officers repeatedly warned High Command that the flanks were vulnerable. One report stated clearly, "The Romanian armies are incapable of resisting a major Soviet attack." Hitler ignored all such warnings. He insisted that the Soviets had no strength left to launch a major offensive. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence had detected exactly where the Axis forces were weakest. Stalin and Zhukov prepare the trap. In Moscow, the Soviet High Command, Stavka, began planning an operation that would turn the tide of the war. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky proposed a massive double envelopment, a pincer movement that would encircle the entire German Sixth Army. The operation would be known as Operation Uranus. It required secrecy, precision, and absolute sacrifice. Fresh Soviet armies were quietly moved into position west and south of Stalingrad. Tanks, cavalry, infantry, artillery, tens of thousands of troops hid in ravines, forests, and camouflaged positions. By mid-November, they were ready. The Germans had no idea what was about to hit them. The storm breaks. November 19th, 1942, the beginning of the end. At 7:20 a.m. on November 19th, the morning sky lit up with the roar of more than 3,000 Soviet artillery pieces. The bombardment shook the frozen ground, smashing into Romanian trenches and command posts. Temperatures were bone-numbing. Snow swept across the steppe. The Romanian soldiers, again and again, reported being overrun by Soviet tanks they could not stop. By midday, defenses were collapsing. Entire Romanian divisions disintegrated. Gaps in the line widened into massive breaches. Soviet armored columns surged through, driving deep into the rear of the Sixth Army. The next day, a second offensive smashed into the southern flank. German commanders realized the danger immediately. Paulus requested permission to withdraw. Hitler refused. The Sixth Army will stand fast. Stalingrad will be held. His refusal condemned hundreds of thousands. November 23rd, encirclement complete. At 4 p.m., Soviet armored units from the north and south met near the town of Kessel. The ring snapped shut. The German Sixth Army and all attached Axis units were trapped in a pocket stretching across the ruins of Stalingrad and the steppe beyond. Nearly 300,000 men were now cut off. One German officer wrote in his diary, "We are trapped, completely. God help us all." What followed would become one of the most horrifying ordeals in military history. Hitler's fatal orders. The Luftwaffe's impossible promise. With the Sixth Army surrounded, German generals begged Hitler to authorize a breakout. They still had the manpower and equipment to escape if they acted quickly. But Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, intervened. He boasted that his Air Force could supply the entire Sixth Army by air, a claim he made without consulting his officers, pilots, or logistics experts. In reality, the Sixth Army needed at least 600 tons of supplies per day. The Luftwaffe could deliver at best 80 to 100 tons, often far less. The numbers made survival impossible, but Hitler wanted to believe Göring's lie. So he issued the command: "The Sixth Army will stay in Stalingrad." Paulus obeys and seals his fate. General Paulus was a disciplined, rule-bound officer. He had never defied a direct order, even as the situation deteriorated. Fuel dwindling, ammunition running out, wounded piling up in frozen shelters. Paulus refused to attempt a breakout without Hitler's permission. He later told an aide, "I will not go down in history as a general who disobeyed his Führer." But in following Hitler's orders, he doomed his entire army. Winter was settling in. Food was disappearing, and the Soviets tightened the noose daily. The Germans were now trapped, hopelessly, irreversibly. The real suffering, the legendary horror of Stalingrad, was only beginning.